Thank you for joining this talk. Really appreciate everyone coming here. And special thank you to our fellow panelists for accepting and working with us on this. So welcome to this. We will be talking about application and infrastructure modernization, which is a very hot topic in the public sector, and how open source is driving this trend, in the industry. Let's go around and do some introductions first, and then we can, get started. So my name is Zohaib Khan, and I'm the App Modernization Practice Lead in Red Hat. We have been working with a lot of our customers, in the field of application modernization. And somebody said to me once, the reality of the applications is that there's no off button for legacy, right? So you cannot just magically turn off your legacy applications and start writing new applications. And this goes to the heart of adopting any type of technology, especially the cloud technology. Red Hat has actually helped a lot of customers take that journey, especially in the public sector. So we're going to cover that topic today, and my team specifically has worked with a lot of you in the field. So that's my introduction. So let's go ahead and.
Hi, I'm Scott Jaffa. I'm a solutions architect in the DevOps practice at Validitech, and our practice really focuses on working with federal customers to improve and modernize their IT infrastructure. We work across the spectrum of technologies and areas in the federal government, and the objective of the practice is to develop a set of solutions, develop a set of philosophies and practices that we can bring to our clients and work with them to solve their unique problems and avoid reinventing the wheel that has already been done elsewhere. More specifically for myself, I am the Deputy Program Manager of Architecture at one of our major clients, spending the bulk of my time there, where they're doing a huge application modernization to take a legacy paper-based and internal technology process and move it to a web-based system, and re-architecting both the applications and the infrastructure to support that effort.
Thank you, Scott.
Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Chin. I work for the U.S. Courts in the Case Management Systems Office. I'm one of the division chiefs, and my division represents solutions architecture, application development, and technology. So one of the things that this office is responsible for is all the mission-critical applications that the third branch of government uses. Those includes the users like the federal judges, the clerks of the courts, their staff, probation and pretrial officers, public attorneys, and anybody who is interested in case management from a legal perspective. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Joel Turner. I'm leading the enterprise architecture effort for the federal judiciary. I'm a colleague of Peter's. I've been with the judiciary for a little over 22 years, and in this role for about 3 years. Primarily what we're trying to do with the enterprise architecture initiatives is we've reorganized it over the last 3 years to go from more of a typical, IT enterprise IT architecture to really kind of aligning our enterprise architecture with the strategic initiatives, desired business outcomes, and ensuring that we're making good investments to get desired business value. So that's something that is a challenging thing to do in our organization. It's a different thought process. We have a very decentralized governance administration in the federal judiciary, so trying to get enterprise type systems in place and thinking about how those systems would integrate together and all work together does become challenging at times. But we have good partners like Peter and others within our agency, and we are making progress.
Good morning. My name is Peter Levin. I come to you from Amida Technology Solutions, which is an open source software company focused on data management. By data management, we mean collection, aggregation, interoperability, and security. Before Amida, I was the Chief Technology Officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs and led their Health Record Modernization Initiative, which is a project that I'm working on again now under the auspices of the EPMO. We are focused primarily on the data interoperability piece, but you can imagine the Secretary's decision back in June is truly an earthquake in the health IT world, where we're trying to figure out how do we take the open source, or mostly open source, functional components of the nation's largest health record system and put it onto a commercial system. Lots of interesting, challenging, juicy technical problems with that.
Well, thank you very much. So let's start, about modernization. Let's talk about that. You guys have heard Margaret talk about the digital transformation journey in the morning, right? And she was saying that, a disruption is coming. And I think where it gets real for all of us is how do we actually take our existing portfolio of applications and infrastructure and systematically move to cloud or emerging technologies. Everybody likes to adopt cloud and new technologies, but generally what I've seen in my experience, the starting point is how do we actually get started in a way that helps us deliver the value that our agencies have, but at the same time, we can innovate, right? So the work that we have been doing with our customers is basically around that, like how to get started. So Red Hat has a specific program to address that. Now, lucky for me that I've worked with Peter in one of the engagements recently to address exactly that. We will start by first taking a look at what modernization is. So for the IT and applications. So it's a very broad term, and it means different things to different people. So let me just start with Peter first. Application or IT modernization. What does it mean for your agency and for your mission, especially when you're doing your job every day? What value that brings, and how would you define that for your needs?
Well, speaking about open source in general, it's becoming more and more accepted, especially in the government. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that there's a lot of value in open source. One is it's based on standards, so the point of entry is actually lower. People understand the standards. They can get the skills that's needed to work with open source, and they can get into it, and you can find contractors that can actually work with open source a lot easier than you did in the past. The next thing with modernization, which the Case Management Systems Office is currently working on, is in the past, when you think about modernization, you think about, let's put out a big contract, let's replace it with a big monolithic system. Well, nowadays with open source, you can actually go into the modernization first steps with lower risks. So what that means is the tools that you use, the technologies that you use, you actually can make a change if you make a mistake. So there's a lot of flexibility as you're using modern open source tools. And then the next thing is, in the government, there's a lot of legacy applications, and there's a lot of legacy data. And how do you modernize with all of that legacy stuff, right? So open source now has a lot of middleware products that allow you to then make data available so that then you can modernize your application layer more easily. So open source plays a huge role in modernization for us.
So I get that modernization is also critical to your mission needs.
Yes.
Like now that you have a large portfolio to manage and
Yes.
take it further. Okay, cool. All right, so Joel, I know that you deal with a lot of infrastructure side of the things, right? And a lot of applications that run today need modern infrastructure as well. So how have you seen modernization play a role, especially on the infrastructure side, especially in your role?
So I would categorize that what we do at our level from the Enterprise Architecture Group is we are looking at both from IT infrastructure as well as applications, modernization of applications. We have a very strong application architecture group as well. And I think these two things go hand in hand, frankly. You can't modernize your applications without modernizing your infrastructure. And when you think about what we do as a judiciary, at its core, we adjudicate cases. That's what we do. And we have a lot of systems that are designed to have people interact with us. And if we continue to propagate these legacy systems and not evolve, that does have ramifications and side effects. So for example, if there's changing legislation, because we are driven by legislation as well, bankruptcy rules, changes in sentencing guidelines, if we can't evolve our systems quickly, that hurts us. We can't meet those needs. We can't meet demands from our constituents. We have practicing attorneys who are using a lot of new technology. And if they can't interact with our systems, they bring in evidence presentation. And if we have old legacy systems and old technology, it's hard for them even to do their cases in our trial courts. So there are ramifications for not modernizing our technology. Security is another area. If you're using legacy technologies and you're not keeping abreast with updates, it becomes very difficult from a security posture to continue to ensure that our systems are secure, number one. And from a trust perspective, that's all we have. We have the public trust. And if you lose that trust, it's very difficult to get it back. So I think at the end of the day, you have to take steps to modernize both your applications and your infrastructure in order to move forward. I guess the last point I would make is that I think it's no longer acceptable for you to have delivery times that span years, which has been typical in the past of government, nor is it acceptable to have provisioning of infrastructure take weeks and months. Because from a development standpoint, if you go to Peter's shop and he is waiting 3 months for a host just to begin development, how is he supposed to be able to produce software in an agile fashion? It just doesn't happen. And then the last thing that I would say is that our users of our technology in the courts, the people who are coming to us, they expect and are using modern technologies. They're on Facebook. They're streaming through Netflix. They're using Google. And when they come to us and they see some of our antiquated legacy applications, the first thing they say to us is, what's going on? Why aren't you evolving? So there's this expectation now. It's no longer just a nice thing. We have to do this.
And I think it becomes real when, I think, Peter, what you were saying was when we were working with you is, if the data and information does not get to the field agents on time, people can lose lives. Like, they can actually die in the field, right? And that's how real this thing is for I guess, this agency. So Scott, let me turn to you, and you're doing a lot of work horizontally with a lot of government sector customers. So what have you seen in terms of what defines modernization based on what you have seen, and what value that brings to the government?
Sure. Yeah. At its core, I think modernization is saying we have changing business requirements, and our technology platform needs to evolve in a way to meet those requirements. Every agency has something different, but a lot of the themes that we've seen are they were used to having a desktop-based application that maybe had a server component, and now they'd like to switch to a web component or enable it so that their users can travel. I know in the last session we had USPTO. Well, they've made a big deal about they can adjudicate cases from wherever they are. Giving the ability for disaster recovery to not be drive to the COOP site, but just have everyone work at home could be a business driver. We talked about data integration. That's a huge ability. We've got information in places. Let's make sure it's available to others, or update a user interface or a new law or other requirement. That's the main thing that they're looking for, and what that translates to is I need to build this new application, I need to respond to something, therefore I need infrastructure and platform capabilities that allow me to do that. Just like Joel said, if it takes 3 months to build a server, then that's a minimum of 3 months for an application team to spin up a new version to make a test. So we're not modernizing infrastructure or applications in and of themselves. There's nothing wrong with a mainframe if your code is working and processing at large scale. What is a problem is when you need to make a change to that code to update and there's no place to test it.
Or add new features.
Exactly. So we see a lot of the drivers of particularly infrastructure and platform as allowing the agility of adapting to business practices, and also taking the lessons learned from how we've done IT and saying, if we build a platform, we don't need to rebuild an entire application stack 30 times over. We can leverage the platform and just make a user interface or a data analytics set. If we're using cloud, whether that's private cloud or public or other things, then requesting a new server takes seconds. Well, if requesting a server takes seconds, I'm not scared of breaking anything, because if I break it, it's a few seconds to get it back. So it's really enabling at its core that agility for business requirements, and it trickles all the way down the system. And in general, that is what the themes that we're seeing from customers are: let us be able to go faster, let us respond to any requirement, and whatever that may mean, please help us do it.
Right. And somebody just said earlier, then, like, with speed comes responsibility, right? So, we have to do this as adults, while we continue to innovate. So, Peter, you talked about some juicy, engagements or work in your introduction. So, how has your experience been when it comes to modernization, especially in the government sector?
Yeah. So it's going to be hard for me to do better than my co-panelists here. So let me attack this from a slightly different perspective, which is what happens if you don't modernize, right? And this is very often how federal officials make their choices. And ultimately, it comes down to money, right? If you can make the case that it's in fact more expensive to not do what you're supposed to do, very often that's a winning argument. But just to review what's already been said, if you don't modernize, you can't do time box delivery, right? The full stop. And this is how many contractors, many of the vendors to the federal government sometimes exploit the system. Sometimes they're not trying to exploit it, they just couldn't guess as well as we in the federal government wanted them to about how long it would take. If you have time box delivery, then you need to modernize your system. You need to have standards-based, openly architected and modular systems. You can't absorb the business rules. My favorite story here is the then Undersecretary of Benefits at VA. You might remember there was a time where service-connected disabilities took 200 days to adjudicate. Can you imagine going?
It doesn't sound like that far in the past, but here we are.
I am happy to see that in my rearview mirror, but it is now a solved problem. But on the topic of juicy ones, and just extraordinary things like trying to change the number of days that a veteran had to get a medical appointment. And remember, these things are coupled, right? They couldn't get the medical appointment, so then they fell out of bounds for the application for their service-connected disability. Literally something that anybody in this room today would go into a Microsoft Word application and change it from 30 to 60. And that was a $250,000 90-day exercise to study to see if they could actually make that change. The data exchange is a hugely important thing. It's certainly the thing that I'm right now most focused on. How do we get the complete, comprehensive, longitudinal record from the VISTA system, the 130 instances of the VISTA system, into this new commercial platform? That's a magnificent problem. I think Scott just said if you don't do this right, people can lose their lives, right? So you're trying to make sure that not only are you transferring the data in a sensible, complete, comprehensive, methodical way, but that when the data finally lands, that things like your allergy to penicillin or your surgical histories or diagnostic tests that need to be run because of a past injury, that those things in fact are going to happen. If they don't happen, then the clinical user could easily make a mistake through no cause or negligence of their own. So data interoperability for me is sort of where the action is right now. Last but not least, if you don't modernize your system, I personally believe that you should be modernizing your system on open source platforms, but if you don't modernize your system, you're at a gross disproportional disadvantage in terms of not only your ability to communicate with your stakeholder community in the federal government, that's everybody. For certain customers, for banks, you have your stakeholder place. For an airline, you have your stakeholder place. And for VA hospitals, we also know very well who our customers are, right? Anybody who used to wear a uniform is now a customer of the VA. So if you don't do that, then you're providing a more expensive, less effective service, and you can't do things that somebody mentioned already, like migrate these functions to the cloud, migrate the registries to the cloud, migrate the decision support systems to the cloud, and that ultimately impacts the quality of care.
Thank you so much. So just to summarize, modernization is important to the agency mission, and we cannot continue to implement the mandates or do what we are required now to do as an agency with systems that are outdated and need upgrading, right? So that's just, the reality now. So thank you for your participation in that. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's look at, how open source has helped in technology landscape today. So, Margaret talked about the innovation, few moments ago about how, open source realm is basically innovating software at a very high pace and enabling new modes of business, right, that we have seen. So I'm just curious from your point of view, for each one of you, like, so what has been your experience with open source software in general, and how it has helped you guys in your missions, in your agencies, for example. So let me start with Joel, on that, and just tell us how your experience has been and what open source has enabled you to do that was not possible, and how has that helped in the last few years.
Sure. So I want to step back a little bit and really talk about, well, I'm going to answer your question, so don't worry. But the judiciary has really always embraced open source. If you think about where we've been, we created electronic filing. And our systems that were built, our case management systems that do that, were all built on open source technologies back in the late 90s and were rolled out in the early aughts. So the judiciary has long been a proponent of using open source technologies for a lot of mission critical systems. This isn't new for us. I think in the last couple of years, our focus from the EA perspective has been really to evangelize Docker, containerization of applications, as well as implementation of OpenShift. So one of the things that we've done is back in 2015, we did a proof of concept on using OpenShift for container orchestration. And we started playing with Docker and seeing, is there some viability for this technology to be used internally? And we picked OpenShift primarily because at that point, you were migrating from version 2 to version 3, and you had made this commitment to not only use Docker, but you're also using Kubernetes as an orchestration platform. And to us, that was hugely important because we were concerned about vendor lock-in, to be fair. We wanted to be able to say, okay, if this doesn't work, but we like these technologies, we could move on, and use Kubernetes, through Google if we wanted to. And so there's a lot of advantages that we saw from this. We did as I said, a proof of concept. Then we did a pilot. As a result of the pilot, we learned a lot about how to containerize legacy applications, how to look at our infrastructure and be able to abstract it away so that our developers can consume that infrastructure and our customers as well. And as a result, we were able to secure funding to go into and start to implement a production environment, which we're in the midst of doing now. But some of the attributes of it that I think are going to be really critical for us, and this is more longer term because we're really at the beginning of our journey, when you think about some of the problems that occur with software development. So the first thing is obviously the self-provisioning piece, getting the host, which I've already talked about. But by using some of these technologies, we can essentially have the containers self-provision the underlying architecture so the developers and the consumers who are getting the applications no longer have to worry about the hosts. It kind of happens, it's like magic to them. It's a black box, which is how it should be. That's how it is on commercial cloud. Nobody sets up servers anymore and installs stuff. Things just run. So that's one thing that was very beneficial. Immutability is another. Right. We get it, if most of you, I'm sure, have seen through change management as you're going from development to testing all the way to production, all the issues that occur with configurations that don't follow through. Well, with Docker and the recipe file, you can be assured that what you start with in development and you test goes all the way through to production. It's really a great thing to be able to solve that problem.
It does make a lot of difference in the release cycles too, right? Like when you
Absolutely.
have to promote that. Yeah.
And then the last thing, because I don't want to take up, I could talk about this for a while, so I don't want to take up that much time, is the ability to be able to do the deployments using either blue-green patterns or to use a canary deployment, which is something that is very difficult to do if you're just using virtual hosts. Containerization and the orchestration allows us to do that really easily to set up those environments and to mitigate our risk and give us a bridge to commercial cloud, which is really our next step for the judiciary. We just started that journey, so I see all these open source technologies as a way for us to gain experience internally, but more importantly, to get us to the ultimate destination, which is commercial or hybrid, really a hybrid cloud model that we're going to hopefully have in place over the next several years as we continue our journey.
Cool. So Peter, you deal with the application side of the things today, right? So what have you experienced in your line of work as far as the open source is concerned, and how has open source helped you in general? Any
Sure.
examples you can?
Yeah, Joel mentioned that open source has been a part of the history of the U.S. course with development. So we want to continue that today and into the future. What we realize is that the more people who are exposed to our code, who have experience with working with the code and using the code, that you can find bugs easier. You can find the vulnerabilities, and then we can fix them once we know about them. But if we don't share the code and we don't have a diverse group looking at the code, then there's things that might get to the end user and it might impact their mission. So those are the things that we're trying to prevent. Open source also helps from a security perspective. One is there's a lot of open source security tools that helps us with that automated testing and making sure that it meets certain standards and it finds certain vulnerabilities. It doesn't just find them, but also identifies the lines of the code that you have to make the change, and it provides a suggestion on what you need to do to make things safer. And then the next thing is, Joel mentioned containers. Containers actually helps with security because then you can develop, test, and up to a certain patch level, and you know that certain things are secure. So when you're deploying with these containers, you have a sense of where your security posture is. And if you need to update them, you can do them through the container, not necessarily a onesie, twosie type of manner. And then lastly is a deployment. So there's a huge benefit with deployment. We're in the midst of moving from physical to virtual to cloud infrastructure. And the use of containers actually is a huge game changer here. It helps us making things more portable. Right. It helps with the automated deployment.
So no more fixing bugs in production.
Yeah, exactly. And plus, we can identify if there's inconsistencies with our infrastructure too. Right. One thing that a lot of people don't talk about, though, is it helps us with automated rollback. Because even though you've tested it, even though everything looks really good in some lower environments, there are things that may break in production. And so it helps you with that rollback, and it helps you with that troubleshooting portion of it. So hopefully that answers your question.
So that's great to hear your experiences with that. So let me go to Peter and ask him, since you do a lot of work with government agencies, and specifically in your line of work, like how are you seeing open source software, especially the way the DevOps movement has come around? How is that helping government do more with their technology?
Great question. So two ways. I think they're both obvious to people who do it and maybe not so obvious to people who use it. The first one, from a production perspective, it allows startups like mine to get a product to the market much more quickly, much less expensively than we would. We were bootstrapped for almost the first 4 years of our existence. Actually, until we had a product, we were bootstrapped, and open source components enabled that. And partnership with Red Hat, of course, was key to this. From a procurement perspective, thinking from the job before the one that I have, it actually has two gigantic advantages, maybe three. The first one is it does end up speeding the procurement. You actually can get the components in the door faster than an alternative mechanism. I'll just put that out there as for me, at least, a truism. The second one is the speed of deployment. Now, all of the agencies will have, in some cases, their own idiosyncratic ATO processes, but there is, I would say, a very human level of trust. Oh, we've seen this component before, we've used this operating system before. You would think that would be obvious, but sometimes it's not because of the different configurations or customizations that are required, but somehow the fact that it's open source lends to, or accelerates that process. Those two things are measurable, right? We could come up and say, well, how long did it take to get this particular somewhat comparable cognate into the infrastructure, and how long did it take that open source version? And I think you would come up with a satisfactory solution. The last point that I'll make, which I mean seriously, but may sound provocative, but it's impossible to measure, it lowers tension. It lowers tension because nobody wants to be the one that made the mistake. I don't want to be the one that chose the wrong component or forced a procurement through or forgot to write something into the requirement, or I did all those things right and the vendor ends up being a turkey. I mean, all these things have happened, right? the beautiful, beautiful thing about open source is when you say, oh, no, 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 what we've decided to do is adopt something that already exists out in the community, something that we can license, something that we can pull down. And guess what? If it doesn't work, we'll just kick it out. And the other two processes, the mechanical administrative processes, feel faster too, right? So we can get it in the door, we can deploy it, we can test it. If it ends up not being the right thing, either we can fix it because we can actually see what we're doing, or we can decide to go through another path. That last one is probably the most important one, but it's also the most difficult one to measure.
Cool. So one thing is that I find in the field is that if you have a problem, there's more great chance that somebody is trying to solve or already solved it in open source, and companies like ours, Red Hat, is trying to productize it. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's usually, it's a good to do like Google search and come up with a GitHub project and, find an open source vendor who is actually supporting you. So Scott, in your opinion, like, you're doing a lot of work across the stack, right? So, how has open source, has helped, in your experience, the way you are seeing, especially across the sector, in your line of work?
Sure. Yeah, probably one of the best things about open source is that agility, that if you talk about the procurement process, I think that's a major thing. If it's an open source product that I can go download to try and evaluate to see if it actually meets my needs, well, then I can put an engineer on it tomorrow and they can do a quick evaluation and say, does this work? If it's a large product or a commercial product, or maybe there's under licensing or they want to sign an NDA or do those things, that adds time, and it also then adds some of that risk that someone feels like I'm asking you to spend a lot of time, and that tension of maybe I made a bad call, so let me be more conservative. It's also really beneficial from a hiring perspective. If
that's a great point.
We pick, like, hey, someone's running COBOL still in this room, and their system works great, and it does exactly what they need to do. But there's only so many COBOL developers out there because we're not teaching it in school. We're not developing industry training programs. It's a language that does its job and does its job perfectly, but the industry and the IT ecosystem as a whole has moved away from. Well, if I modernize and say I'm writing a node, then I get someone who saw the Netflix technology stack and thought it was the most amazing thing ever and started learning Node and did some projects, and they're coming in eager and looking to do stuff, and saying, oh, federal, I don't want to do that. And we're like, no, we actually want you to write Node on containers in this immutable deployment stack, all the things we're talked about. It gives us a bigger breadth of candidates and an ability to get more of that ecosystem. And then, as was hit, I can Google the problem. If I'm trying to use this library and I'm having an issue with it, chances are someone has. If they haven't, it's open source. I can submit a patch upstream. And if I need one more little capability, instead of it being a large procurement process or a research or a huge COTS product, if I'm using the Unix philosophy of a lot of small tools that do their job well, and I find a 500-line library that gives me that exact capability I need, maybe it's a data integration layer that provides some transformations, it becomes very easy to pull in, try, use, integrate into the stack, and if it becomes deprecated or the ecosystem moves away from it, it's a very easy switch. Or if I've decided it's critical, we have the code, we can then support it. So it gives us a lot of that flexibility kind of across the board to do what needs to be done for whatever solution that customer is asking for.
And you mentioned a great point, like if somebody submits a patch, regardless of whether you're an agency or, there are some 3-letter acronym agencies that have done a lot of work with us. We actually help that make it upstream and bring it to products. So we have a little bit of, about 8 minutes left to this. So I just want to go around and, have some closing remarks from all of you. Security is very important to government and also like moving faster with technology. So let's just go around and, in your closing remarks, like especially as a takeaway for the audience, what would you say, has been like when it comes to open source and movements like DevOps, when are doing, especially when it comes to modernizing your large portfolio, where do you think the struggles are versus where do you think that we are making progress? So just real quick. So let's just go around from Scott and we can take it from there.
Sure. I think the struggle is One is kind of how to start. We're pushing so many different things. We're pushing Agile. We're saying, hey, there's DevOps. Oh, we've got containers. All of these things are great, but where do I start? What do I bite off first? Right. Or as an organization that's been doing something away for a while, they say, oh, I want to modernize this huge system. Well, maybe they only need to modernize one piece of it. Maybe they should just start with making a new web front end and don't worry about it in the back end or the data layers and just create a new interface to it. There's a lot of, it really comes down to where do I start and what do I tackle. The other challenge that I feel like I've seen in a takeaway is a lot of places, the applications are shiny, the applications are what you see. I do have an infrastructure and platform background. I'm a little biased on this. But a lot of places, a lot of places look at it as let's rewrite a new application, and then it becomes, oh, I want to deploy this thing and scale it and do blue-green deployments and do rolling upgrades. Oh, I guess we should do containers. Hey guys, can you have that ready next week? We like to be fast. We're not always that fast. But I think that at the core, the entire DevOps movement is about agility. It's about communication. It's about collaboration. All of these tools, all of these technologies, they feed into it, but they aren't in and of itself. And I'd say my big takeaway is pick one thing that you want to do better, regardless of what it is, regardless of where it is. Get some people together, have a conversation, and try something. Because the worst that's going to happen is you're still where you were yesterday. The best that's going to happen, you've made something great and can snowball from there.
That's a great thought. Peter?
Sure. We talked a lot about benefits in development, testing, DevOps, so on and so forth with open source. One thing I think we need to keep in mind is that as we're looking into the future with artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, big data, what do you do with data, predictive analytics, those kind of things. The DevOps is actually something that helps you get there. Right. So, being able to ingest more and more data, figuring out how to analyze it and figure out what to do with it. I mean, open source plays a huge role in that. So as we keep talking about developing applications and deployments into the systems, those are just ways of doing something. But we have to always remember what is our ultimate goal here. And so if it helps us get there, we can definitely find value in it. So if you're going to take anything away, we're still on a path. We're not there yet, but it's helping us get to the end of the journey.
Cool. Joel?
So I'm going to tackle it from a little bit of a different angle. And I've heard a lot of this in other presentations today. I think the technology is not the difficult part. It really isn't. I mean, there's a lot of good technology out there. If you have smart people, they figure it out. What it does come down to is the people. And I know in the engagements that I've tried to do from the enterprise architecture perspective, it's all about what value are you trying to bring, what problem are you trying to solve, and how are you impacting me? Because when we talk about modernization, right, what you're really talking about is you're changing people's jobs. They've been doing something the same way for X amount of time. They're comfortable with the technology. You're now taking them out of their comfort zone. So what's the urgency for them? Why should they do it? What's the cost benefit for them? And so I think we really need to take that into account as we start to implement DevOps processes, as we start to modernize infrastructure. If we automate all the infrastructure, what happens to the guy who's been building those servers for you? Is he out of a job?
Right.
How do you convince that person or their management that the opportunity cost of not doing this work is greater than continuing to do this manual work? What are you not doing as a result?
And that's a great point, because a lot of organization resistance actually come from that mindset.
Correct.
And it's important to address that up front.
And one last point, and I'll turn to Peter, is I think that people have to recognize that your security folks are not the enemy. They're people too. They have a hard job. They're trying to keep up with a lot of threats. And a lot of times when they're saying no, they're just not up to speed on the technology. You've got to educate them and bring them along on the journey. And they will be your greatest allies if you can bring them along the way and teach them that what you're trying to do is going to help them.
Right. And change is the only constant here. So we have to translate the security mandates and requirements into this new paradigm, and that's a given. So that's one thing that, to Joel's point, I think that's really great. When we modernize the system, we have to take those accounts. So let me go to Peter and, get your thoughts on, all that.
Perfect segue. So why do the security guys say no all the time? There's a bunch of reasons. First of all, the tools that we need to enforce things like NITS compliance and FIPS compliance, they don't really exist. So right now it's a very manual, time-intensive, subjective process with very, very limited training for the people who actually do have the certifications. The tools that exist don't work very well. Very, very few exceptions to that rule. We at AMITA, we work at the highest level of abstractions and things like security information event monitors, and at the lowest levels of abstraction, literally down to the transistors on the chips. I can talk to you for a long time about what does and doesn't exist in terms of coverage. Just how do you even know that you know? And systematic, scientific, automated ways of making those assessments. Let me give you a very, very specific example. There is no such thing today in the market as a rules reconciliation engine. And by that I mean many of you, those of you who are anywhere proximate to the security world will know what a SIM is, a security information event monitor. Those of you who don't know what that is, just think of it as a single pane of glass, the thing that says you can send the email, you can't send the email, we think we got breached, we think we're okay, there's a denial of service, there isn't a denial of service, whatever it happens to be. There are point solutions, they all get aggregated in one place. Now, not just in the federal government, but especially in the federal government, there are lots of new tools coming online. Cyber is now a thing, right? Lots of investment and lots of attention for obvious reasons. And many of the agencies that we work with, they want to move away from the platform they're on to another one, but they are so deathly afraid that they're jumping from the frying pan in the fire. Why? Because they can't take what they've learned, they can't take the accumulated knowledge of the breaches that they've defended and the patches that they've made and put them onto the new system. So just ordinary things like a rules reconciliation engine, as a product idea for those of you who are interested, would be immensely beneficial. And there's like 25 more where that comes from. So I think open source is really the solution to this, at least for my time, for my money, for my attention. I spend personally a lot of time looking at open source solutions to the security problem, SIM being probably the best one.
Cool. So I thank you for attending the session today, and we will be hanging out in the audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But enjoy the rest of the day.